This is NTD Evening News. Live from our NTD Global Headquarters in New York City, here is Tiffany Meyer.
Good evening and thank you for joining us tonight. Rescue operation remains ongoing in Taiwan after the island was hit with a 7.4 magnitude earthquake. Officials say at least 9 people were killed and more than 1,000 others injured. NTD's Sam Wong has the details.
It's Taiwan's most powerful earthquake in a quarter century. Footage shows a restaurant rocked by violent tremors, with bottles sliding off the shelf and shattering to the ground. In Hualien City, a multi-story building came crashing down onto a busy street, sending pedestrians and drivers running for their lives. And along the coastline, a massive landslide. Taiwan's President-elect William Lai says search and rescue remains a top priority.
We have to check carefully how many people are still trapped. We must quickly help those who are trapped, and the wounded must be given the best medical care.
The 7.4 magnitude earthquake took place at around 8 a.m. local time. It struck the island's eastern coast, just 11 miles south of Hualien City. But tremors were felt across Taiwan, including its capital Taipei. Collapsing structures left people stranded inside. Some were pulled to safety quickly, while first responders looked for others still trapped under the rubble. Officials said more than 140 people were feared buried in ruins, many of them tourists in poorly maintained hotels, and several dozen people are believed trapped in collapsed highway tunnels. An estimated 87,000 households in Taiwan were without power as of the early afternoon, but the island's electricity operator said the 2 nuclear power stations are not affected. The U.S. Geological Survey recorded about 30 aftershocks greater than 4.0 magnitude. The agency added more aftershocks as strong as magnitude 7 could happen in the days ahead. Across the ocean, tsunami warnings were briefly triggered in Japan and parts of the Philippines. Taiwan is located on the Pacific Ring of Fire, where earthquakes happen often. The White House says it's monitoring the situation in Taiwan and is ready to provide assistance as needed. Sam Wong, NTD News.
A tragic incident yesterday in the Gaza Strip. 7 humanitarian aid workers were killed by an Israeli airstrike. NTD reporter and former counterintelligence agent Jason Perry is here to explain the latest on the situation. Jason, has Israel figured out what happened?
Well, Israel has released new details on this tragic incident that killed aid workers from the World Central Kitchen. Now, this organization has been working closely with Israel for the last few months to help deliver aid to the Gaza Strip. Now, last night, Israel's chief of the general staff apologized for what happened, and he gave an update on the final on the investigations on what he saw so far. Let's have a look.
I want to be very clear. The strike was not carried out with the intention of harming WCK aid workers. It was a mistake that followed a misidentification at night during a war in a very complex conditions. It shouldn't have happened.
The Israeli military likely thought the aid vehicles had terrorists inside traveling through the Gaza Strip at night. And it's also possible there was a miscommunication because the World Central Kitchen released a statement saying their aid convoys had coordinated with Israel Defense Forces, which coordinated their movements, which is something very critical when traveling in a war zone.
And will there be more information that comes out about the investigation?
Yes, the Israeli general said there is an independent investigation going on that will be completed in the coming days. And he said they will learn from the conclusions of the investigation and will implement what's necessary to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. Israel also established a new humanitarian command center to help improve the way they coordinate aid distribution in the Gaza Strip. And on the other hand, the World Central Kitchen has paused their operations in the Gaza Strip, and the CEO said this tragic incident was unforgivable.
Now, there is also another Israeli airstrike that has been drawing a lot of attention, one in which Israel is said to have struck an Iranian embassy in Syria. What's the latest on that?
Now, what's interesting here is that Israel recently said that this was actually not an embassy, but it was a military compound disguised as an embassy. And soon after the attack, Iran vowed to take revenge on Israel for the attack that killed 2 Iranian generals and 5 military advisors. So the question now is, how will Iran retaliate? Middle East expert on the Council of Foreign Relations think tank, Elliot Abrams, said he does not think Iran wants an all-out war between the Iran-backed Hezbollah terrorist group and Israel. But he said Iran could try to bomb an Israeli embassy somewhere in the world. So the world from now on will be keeping a close eye to see how this situation will play out.
Jason, thank you so much for those updates.
Thank you.
The White House is asking Congress to approve a multi-billion-dollar weapons sale to Israel, this while publicly expressing outrage over the deaths of 7 humanitarian aid workers killed in an Israeli airstrike. Our Washington correspondent Luis Martinez has more.
The Biden administration has sent notices to 2 congressional committees to begin the review process of a weapons deal that would see the transfer of 50 F-15 fighter jets to Israel. The deal would total over $18 billion and would be the largest weapons sale to Israel in over a decade. At the same time, White House spokespersons have expressed outrage at the death of 7 aid workers, including 1 U.S. dual national, during an IDF airstrike in Gaza.
We were outraged to learn of an IDF strike that killed a number of civilian humanitarian workers yesterday from the World Central Kitchen, which has been relentless in working to get food to those who are hungry in Gaza and, quite frankly, around the world.
We've spoken directly to the Israeli government about this particular incident. We've impressed upon the Israelis the absolute imperative of doing more to protect innocent civilian lives.
The Biden administration has approved approximately 100 weapons sales since the October 7 attack by Hamas on Israel. These weapons sales were smaller and did not require congressional approval. According to the latest Gallup poll, 75% of Democrats disapprove of the military actions Israel has taken in Gaza. President Biden is facing pushback from his own party, and calls for ceasefire follow him throughout his campaign trail. In February, a group of 20 Democratic senators, led by Senator Van Hollen of Maryland, pressed Biden to require Israel to commit to international humanitarian law. Last month, Senator Chuck Schumer called Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu an obstacle to peace. And last night, a physician attending a White House meeting with Muslim community leaders walked out on the president after expressing his disapproval.
The rhetoric that has been coming out of the Biden administration, that's been coming out of the White House, it's frustrated a lot of people, especially people who are Palestinian Americans, Muslim Americans, Arab Americans. We are not satisfied.
Next week, when Congress reconvenes, lawmakers will have to address President Biden's $18 billion weapons sales request. And it is also expected that the House will put to a vote a $17 billion supplemental military aid package for Israel, also requested by the Biden administration. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Luis Eduardo Martinez, NTD News.
President Biden teaming up with Senator Bernie Sanders to slam former President Trump over health care. But new polling in last night's primary results are posing fresh warning signs to Biden's 2024 campaign. NTD's White House correspondent Iris Tao has the details.
As former President Trump this week continues to hammer Biden on the border crisis, and President Biden on Wednesday teamed up with his one-time presidential rival, Senator Bernie Sanders, to attack Trump on health care. Here's President Biden and Senator Sanders accusing Trump of trying to cut Social Security and Medicare while vowing to fund these programs by raising taxes on wealthy Americans. Watch.
As my predecessor says, kicking millions of Americans off their health insurance. I'm going to protect Social Security and Medicare along with Bernie and other members of Congress to make sure the wealthy begin to pay their fair share.
We will be lowering the cost of health care in our country.
Former President Trump, meanwhile, has pushed back on Biden's accusations, saying while he wants to cut government waste, he will never do it through cutting Social Security or Medicare. Meanwhile, Bernie Sanders' public show of support for Biden on Wednesday could give Biden some boost with progressive and young voters who were critical to Biden's victory back in 2020. But Biden's campaign is seeing some new warning signs. A new poll by the Wall Street Journal is now showing that former President Trump is leading Biden in 6 of 7 key battleground states, and that's in part fueled by voters' concerns over the economy and Biden's job performance. And in the one swing state where Biden is leading, is also facing new challenges. In Wisconsin, over 40,000 voters voted uninstructed, which means uncommitted, in a primary contest last night to protest Biden's handling of the war in Gaza. That's more than double the margin that Biden won Wisconsin by in 2020. And Trump, who was campaigning in Wisconsin on Tuesday, Thursday night also again challenged Biden for a one-on-one debate.
We have an empty podium right here to my right. You know what that is? That's for Joe Biden. I'm trying to get him to debate so that we can discuss in a friendly manner the real problems of our country, of which there are many, instead of trying to have corrupt prosecutors fight your battles for you. That's no good.
And President Biden has previously responded to Trump's call for a debate, saying it depends on Trump's behavior. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
Judge Juan Merchan today rejected Trump's bid to delay the April 15th hush money trial. Trump's attorneys had asked that it be postponed until after the Supreme Court rules on the presidential immunity claims raised in another case. Merchan said the March 7th filing was untimely, adding that the attorneys had ample opportunities to raise this issue before then. And in Trump's classified documents case, special counsel Jack Smith is pushing back on Judge Aileen Cannon, the prosecutor rejecting Cannon's request that he submit competing jury instructions that take into account arguments made by the Trump team. NTD's legal correspondent Arlene Richards has more.
Charging Donald J. Trump.
Special counsel Jack Smith is not happy with a request made by Judge Aileen Cannon. In a late Tuesday filing, Smith rejected Cannon's request for proposed jury instructions, saying that legal premise is wrong. The judge had asked both sides to submit instructions based on two competing scenarios, each scenario involving the Presidential Records Act, a legal theory proposed by the defense, but not included anywhere in Smith's indictment. Smith writing in part, the court should be aware at the outset that Trump's entire effort to rely on the PRA is not based on any facts. It is a post hoc justification that was concocted more than a year after he left the White House. The defense has argued that former President Trump had broad authority under the act to remove records from the White House and deem them personal, and that he was still the president when he reviewed and selected those records, including records marked classified. In their own proposed jury instructions, Trump's attorneys suggested the jurors should be told that Trump was authorized to access the classified records during his presidency, and that applicable law authorizes former presidents and vice presidents and their designees to access classified information after their terms are completed under certain circumstances. If Judge Cannon permits the Presidential Records Act to be included at trial, Smith's case against Trump could be turned upside down. Smith says if Cannon concludes that the jury should be instructed to use the act, he will need enough time before trial to appeal. Arlene Richards, NTD News.
Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Sonar images showing the mangled wreckage of the collapsed Baltimore bridge are released. They give a glimpse into the challenging task awaiting cleanup crews. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineering released these images showing the bottom of the Patapsco River. You can see the wreckage of the Francis Scott Key Bridge that collapsed last week. The military obtained the images using a primary sonar tool called Coda Octopus. It helps guide divers who have to operate in virtual darkness. Over 1,000 personnel from U.S. Army Corps of Engineers are working to remove the debris from the bridge and reopen the port of Baltimore. Texas today keeps fighting for its right to arrest and deport illegal immigrants. This as the Biden campaign is facing backlash for misrepresenting a statement made by former President Trump. NTD's Arian Pazdar has the border update.
The legal battle between Texas and the Biden administration continues. An appeals court on Wednesday held yet another hearing for a controversial Texas immigration law. It would allow state authorities to arrest and deport illegal immigrants. The law is currently on hold while the appeals court decides if it is constitutional. The bill would set a historic precedent because immigration has always been the job of the federal government, not individual states. Attorneys for Texas today argued that the law would actually align with that. Immigrants would be allowed to choose whether they'll be charged with illegal trespass in Texas or leave the country. Attorneys say that's critical about this. It's portrayed as Texas is by ourselves just flying people off to some other place, and that's not accurate. The appeals court made no decision after Wednesday's hearing. Also on Wednesday, the Biden campaign is facing backlash for posting this 7-second clip of former President Trump.
The Democrats say, please don't call them animals. They're humans. I said, no, they're not humans. They're not humans. They're animals.
They didn't include the part leading up to his statement, which was this.
The 22-year-old nursing student in Georgia who was barbarically murdered by an illegal alien animal.
The Trump campaign said President Trump was clearly speaking of Laken Riley's killer. Donald Trump Jr. asked, does Biden think her killer is a good person and not an animal? The White House didn't address the issue at Wednesday's press briefing. And lastly, video shows immigrants on Tuesday cutting through a fence to cross the border into Texas. A few managed to get through before Texas National Guard officers showed up at the scene.
Back up! Back up! Back the up! Get the off of him!
The officers then sent them back to a dry riverbed. The National Guard later repaired the fence at the spots where the immigrants had damaged it. Arian Pastar, NTD News.
Reactions are pouring in following the deadly airstrike on Iran's consulate building in Syria. Joining me now to discuss the heightened tensions in the region is Anders CORR, publisher of the Journal of Political Risk and principal of CORR Analytics. Anders CORR, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Thanks.
Now, following the deadly airstrike on Iran's embassy in Syria, China and Russia are now backing Iran's expected retaliation against Israel. Now, what kind of message is this sending to the international community?
This is typical, axis of evil activity between China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. We'll see if they get involved too. But the strike in Damascus, was against the IRGC, which is a known terrorist organization. It's part of the state apparatus in Iran. And so, I don't really expect Iran to retaliate immediately. I think that there's a lot of messaging coming out of Iran that they want to take it slow. They don't want to get involved. I think the last thing, they would much prefer to fight Israel with proxies, the Houthis, the Hamas, Hezbollah. And I think that what the IRGC is doing, and more specifically the Quds Force of the IRGC, both of which are terrorist organizations, what they're doing really is, I think, instigating the proxies, the Iranian proxies in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Gaza to attack Israel and at the same time limiting their own exposure to retaliation. So what Israel has done in terms of the Damascus strike is they're bringing it home to the IRGC, and I think that's it's problematic from an international law perspective. But at the same time, Iran is breaking international law right and left, and so and Israel really sees itself in an existential struggle to save its state.
On that note, what can we expect in terms of escalations? For instance, many are noting that there are U.S. troops in Gaza helping with humanitarian aid, and if Iran's escalation or retaliation hits them, as in U.S. troops, would the U.S. get pulled back into another war in the area?
It's possible. I really don't see Iran wanting to escalate. Israel has a much more powerful military. I don't think Iran would win. It could pull the U.S. in. You could see the mullahs toppled in Tehran. So I think they know that. I think they would prefer to maintain a moderate level or a low level of fight with Israel until, to galvanize their supporters within Iran and to stay in power. This is a typical authoritarian dictatorial approach to staying in power. When you start to lose public support, you start a war somewhere to benefit from the rally around the flag effect.
And now we did see China condemn the strike in Damascus, but they have yet to condemn Hamas over October 7th. What's in it for China to side with Hamas?
China is looking to, I think China is looking to create chaos around the world so that it can, essentially set its enemies against each other, sets other states against each other fighting. And at the end of the day, it steps into a power vacuum. It looks like a peacemaker. And we'll see if they attack Taiwan or not, whether they jump into the fray or if they try to stay high and dry until the end of the fighting and just focus on building their economy and their military so that they can come out shining at the end. Well, that's the big question, I think.
Now, U.S. officials are warning of increased cyber attacks from Russia, Iran, and China, saying they'll hit everything, everywhere. Now, what needs to be done not to just protect critical U.S. infrastructure, but also to counter this type of a threat?
Since the Trump administration, at least, the United States Cyber Command has been striking back offensively, preemptively, I think, against the Chinese-Russian cyber operations. And essentially in cyberspace, I think offense is the best defense. And so I think basically what we'll see is ramping up of those kinds of capabilities. I mean, even, they're already attacking, in some cases, water companies in the United States that have a component from Israel. As kind of a way of protesting the Gaza war. But of course, that's totally unacceptable. And, we're going to have to ramp up our capabilities against this axis of evil. And I think we're going to have to start hitting them with harder sanctions, economic sanctions, and imposing secondary sanctions on countries that continue to do business with them despite their really what should be considered terrorist attacks.
Anders CORR, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
A government report finds that Microsoft committed a cascade of avoidable errors that allowed Chinese hackers to breach the tech giant's network and later the email accounts of senior U.S. officials last year. NTD's Don Ma has more.
The U.S. government gives a scathing review of Microsoft's cybersecurity. Last year, Chinese hackers successfully invaded hundreds of Microsoft email accounts, including those of Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo, as well as U.S. Ambassador to China Nicholas Burns and Congressman Don Bacon. The U.S. Cyber Safety Review Board says Microsoft's security culture is, quote, inadequate and requires an overhaul, that it made a cascade of avoidable errors that allowed this to happen. We got an expert opinion from cybersecurity law scholar Star Cashman on this. Here's what she told us.
It's not necessarily a Microsoft-specific problem. I think that people would be surprised at the fact that many tech giants and tech companies in general who obtain and possess very high amounts of private, sensitive user information and user data, they are falling behind on their cybersecurity practices. And it tends to be that cybersecurity best practices only really increase after a hack or a breach occurs.
The Cyber Safety Review Board says the intrusion was preventable and should never have occurred. That apparently Microsoft didn't even detect the hack. What happened was that the company relied on a customer who had to inform them they saw anomalies. The board says that Microsoft has worse security than a slew of other cloud service providers. The board says Microsoft is a high-value target for adversaries, such as China. And this is because Microsoft is involved in critical, ubiquitous products that underpin the foundations of America's economy and security. Over 1 billion people rely on Microsoft. It's the custodian of vast amounts of data, including personal information, government communications, trade secrets, and intellectual property.
Joining me now to discuss the latest in another Trump legal case, the so-called hush money case, is David Gelman. He's a criminal defense attorney and former federal prosecutor. David Gelman, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Trump's gag order in the hush money case has been expanded to include the judge's daughter. This is after Trump railed against both the judge and the daughter. Now, we are learning that the wife of the judge had actually worked for AG Letitia James, who is the one that launched the civil fraud case against Trump. Now, is this a conflict of interest for the judge, or how does this compare to the case of, say, Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, whose wife is a conservative activist?
Oh my God, there's so much conflict. You might as well call this like the Middle East. Right now, what's going on is not only does the judge have a daughter who was, or still is, I should say, a fundraiser for for Democrats, but then his wife worked for Letitia James. Now, you obviously have to understand that Letitia James, there's probably like 600-700 attorney generals in the whole state that work under her. So we're not saying that she is necessarily close to Letitia James, but just the appearance of impropriety from her and from the daughter, who has made multiple Facebook posts, has been very public in her dislike of Donald Trump, that should be enough for the judge to recuse himself. This is not a complicated matter, really. And a judge really has a duty. If there is just an appearance, and this kind of goes towards Bonnie Willis, if you will, but if there is an appearance of impropriety, the judge has to recuse himself. I'm hoping as the case gets closer that the judge will come to his senses and say, you know what, it's best for all parties and the judicial system in general if I step aside and have another judge be the person who handles this matter.
Now, there's also the judge who criticized Trump on air. He's now facing ethics violations. He was also facing some potential calls for impeachment. Now, the complaint against him reads that this will send a clear message to other federal judges, especially D.C. judges, that they cannot take off their judicial robes and climb into the political ring, adding that if the council does not act, then Congress should. What do you make of that? Do you agree with this?
100% I agree with it. Judges should not be talking or giving quotes, if you will, about matters that they are presiding over or any other judge is presiding over. Leave that private, all right? Leave that into your own home, if you will. But a judge, they have a duty. They're higher in the judicial system. They are somebody that you're supposed to be looking at and looking for advice for. You're not, and that you believe is above the fray. They are not to be going on network TV and giving opinions, whether you like it or not, about Donald Trump or anybody for that matter. I've never seen this before. I don't know if it's because we're living in a new age of social media and just everybody thinks they can say everything they want whenever they want, but this is completely unprofessional of this judge. And at least the ethics committee is taking a look at this individual.
Now, speaking of defying, say, gag orders, many headlines note that Trump has been doing that. But switching gears a bit, in the Georgia elections case, AG Bonnie Willis herself has been found in the hot seat. She's speaking about race, saying that her and Nathan Wade's relationship was only looked into because they're both Black. Now, lawyers for Trump have previously noted her comments in court papers, saying that she should be dismissed as she is improperly injecting racial animus into the case. What do you make of this whole thing?
You know, silence is golden. That's how I always look at it. And when the judge specifically states in an order that you are not to talk about your case or just talking about your race and ethnicity and making this public, which the judge did state in the order, and she literally can't wait 2 or 3 days to go out and go make a campaign stop and go campaign stating that she's, again, not going anywhere and going after Trump. It is a complete outrage, and it's a mockery of the judicial system. You know, she did everything wrong in the beginning, and it's amazing that, frankly, she's still on the case. Have some common sense just for once and just not do this. But the ethics board of Georgia probably not going to do anything about it. And the judge, you know, he's probably going to scold her, I guess, but he's not going to do anything about it, because if he had any fortitude of doing something, he would have kicked her off the case originally.
David Gelman, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Wisconsin's constitution now includes 2 tighter election rules. Voters approved the ballot measures in yesterday's primary. They ban private funds from election administration and closely define the role of an election worker. NTD's Jeremy Sandberg has more on the new measures.
Wisconsin voters are projected to approve 2 amendments to the state's constitution after answering questions on Tuesday's ballot. Private money to fund elections will be banned in the Badger State in response to grants in 2020 from Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, known as Zuckerbucks. Some Republicans argue the money helped Democratic turnout in the state's largest cities that year and unfairly shaped the outcome of the election. Biden won Wisconsin by less than 21,000 votes. The second measure will only allow officials designated by law to administer elections. That's already state law, but putting it in the Constitution makes it more difficult to repeal or change. The Associated Press projected both measures to pass with over 50% of the vote and 80% of precincts reporting. Opponents argue the amendments make no guarantee of increased government funding to help run elections once private sources are banned. Some say the measures could create unintended obstacles, like stopping local clerks from accepting donated supplies, or the use of privately owned buildings as polling places. Both ballot measures were in reaction to grant money that came from the Center for Tech and Civic Life in 2020. It received a $300 million donation that year from Zuckerberg and his wife for election officials to buy protective supplies and run elections during the COVID pandemic. The Wisconsin Republican Party stated Wisconsin sent a clear message. Elections belong to voters, not out-of-state billionaires. At least 27 states have outlawed or restricted private election grants since 2020. Jeremy Sandberg, NTD News.
Wisconsin's Democratic Governor Tony Evers is hoping to loosen one election rule. He's urging the state's Supreme Court to overturn its ruling on drop boxes. In 2022, the conservative majority court said drop boxes for collecting absentee ballots are illegal. At the time, the court wrote that an absentee ballot must be returned by mail or the voter must personally deliver it to the municipal clerk at the clerk's office or a designated alternate site. The court is now under more liberal control. The current justices agreed last month to revisit the case due to fierce opposition. Drop boxes have been used for years in Wisconsin, but they exploded in popularity in 2020 when COVID-19 restrictions were in place. Welcome back. I'm Tiffany Meyer. So-called red flag gun laws. The laws allow someone with close ties to a gun owner to ask the courts to take their firearms away. A New York court recently upheld the state's version of such laws. NTD's Daniel Monahan speaks with 2 attorneys for analysis.
Supporters of red flag gun laws say they can save lives by preventing unstable individuals from killing themselves or others. Attorney Drew Stevenson says there are often many warning signs before someone commits a mass shooting.
I know people are very sensitive about guns, but it's not all that different from if you get pulled over while you're intoxicated, that they impound your car, right? And so we're essentially impounding the guns.
Stevenson says in most cases, it is law enforcement, close family members, or healthcare providers who can inform the court about the danger someone with a gun may pose.
And so it's not just anyone. It's not like somebody can just call in a prank call and have someone's guns get taken away. There has to be some evidence, and it has to come through one of those groups and then has to go before a judge.
Stevenson acknowledges that there's always a risk that those who enforce laws may abuse their power, but says that's what lawsuits and internal affairs reviews are for.
It's not a blank check for a cop to just go around harassing people and taking their guns away. It's not even necessarily the same as a search warrant. They're going to have a very specific order from a judge.
New York Attorney Peter Tillum disagrees. He feels red flag gun laws are ripe for abuse.
So you're talking about people who have clean records. And now we're authorizing the police to break down their door and take away their guns. If there's an allegation by anyone, even a disgruntled ex, then the police have every incentive to try to take your guns away.
The attorney says fair hearings are hard to imagine.
Once a police officer comes to a judge and says this person is a danger to themselves or others, the judge is in a pretty tough position not to take away the guns. And then the person goes out and does something, it would be the judge's picture on the front page of the paper.
Tillum says red flag gun laws virtually eliminate the physician-patient privilege, explaining once an allegation is made under such laws, the judge is authorized to get all the person's medical records. The attorney cautions against the slippery slope of people exchanging their constitutional rights under the banner of safety.
I think that what it comes down to is, are you more scared of what the government can do, or are you more scared of what maybe a lone mentally ill person can do?
Attorney Drew Stevenson is skeptical of slippery slope arguments about gun control. He says society and police can't ignore people who have been talking about doing a mass shooting or giving off other warning signs.
We can't live in a society where we can't function safely just because of something that might happen someday, many years from now, if a whole bunch of other things happen between now and then. And that's the slippery slope fallacy.
The Biden administration recently announced a new national office to help states implement red flag laws. The office is called the Federal Extreme Risk Protection Order Resource Center. Daniel Monahan, NTD News.
And now for your sports news, we're joined by NTD's Dave Martin. Dave, plenty to discuss today, but let's start in the NFL, where Buffalo's star receiver Stefon Diggs is headed to Houston in a blockbuster trade. Why does this make sense for the Bills?
Well, you don't necessarily get better by trading one of the best receivers in the game. But if you're going to trade him, now is probably the right time, actually. I mean, he's 30 years old, which is when players typically normally start to decline. I mean, I really don't think he has yet. And he's a big base salary, $18.5 million, which is one of the highest on the team. And when you're a successful team like the Bills, it's tough to keep all your star players signed while staying under the salary cap. Now for Houston, they just found their franchise quarterback in C.J. Stroud, who was tremendous last year. Even better for them, he's on a rookie contract for a couple more years, which are much cheaper, so they can afford Diggs' salary. Now they gave they gave Buffalo a second-round pick in the trade, so I'm sure the Bills will be drafting a receiver in this draft after losing Diggs, and they already lost Gabe Davis in free agency, so it's going to be a big draft, I think, for the Buffalo Bills.
Well, now looking at women's college basketball, the TV ratings for Monday's Iowa-LSU rematch drew a record crowd for a women's game. Now, what made this game such a must-see event?
Well, first, Caitlin Clark, I mean, she's already considered maybe the best women's player ever, and she hasn't even graduated to the WNBA yet. She's very entertaining to watch, I would say. She draws a large crowd wherever she plays. Plus, this was a rematch of last year's national championship game that LSU won, and it looked like there could have been some bad blood between the teams and players, specifically between Clark and LSU's popular star Angel Reese. After it appeared, Reese might have taunted her after winning the game. But the TV audience numbers here are staggering, 12.2 million viewers. To put that in perspective, that's also a higher rating than 4 of the 5 NBA Finals games. That's higher than the clinching game of the World Series last fall. In fact, on ESPN, it's the most watched basketball game, whether men's or women's. Now, I will grant ESPN does not air the men's NCAA tournament games. In any case, Iowa won behind Clark's 41 points. They will play UConn in the Final Four on Friday night.
Well, sticking with basketball, former NBA great Jerry West has been elected to the Hall of Fame for a record 3rd time, this time for his work as a team executive. What were some of the highlights as a general manager?
You know, as great of a player as he was, and you mentioned he's already in the Hall of Fame as both a player and as a member of the 1960 Olympic team. It's hard to say whether he was an even better team executive. You know, he was the architect of those great Laker teams from the 1980s that won 5 NBA titles. Then after Magic and Kareem retired in around 1990, 1991, he completely rebuilt the Lakers into another powerhouse, punctuated by signing Shaq and drafting Kobe Bryant in the same offseason just 5 years later. I mean, those two won back-to-back titles to start the new millennium and started a new dynasty. Now, you think about what Michael Jordan, the Bulls, did in the 90s, winning 6 titles. They haven't even made the finals since then, so it's very difficult to completely overhaul a franchise. He did that so fast. Then he moved on to Memphis. After that, he turned them into a good team. They were a doormat in the NBA. Then he was a consultant for Golden State, helped them create the team that won 4 titles in an 8-year period. So he has quite an eye for talent.
Well, now changing gears to baseball, voters in Kansas City rejected a proposed stadium tax, which would have helped fund a new stadium for the Royals. Does this mean the team will be looking to move?
Well, as a fan of the Royals, I certainly hope not, but of course it is a possibility. Their lease doesn't expire, I don't believe, until 2030. Now, this same vote would have also helped fund some renovations for the Kansas City Chiefs. Both those stadiums share a parking lot. But the Royals said that structural damage to the stadium will cost $1 billion to repair. They would prefer a new stadium instead. This vote would have raised some $300 million each for the Royals and Chiefs. Now, it's possible they could try a different county. This was Jackson County, which is downtown Kansas City. But Kansas City, of course, extends across the state line into Kansas, so there are other possibilities with counties there. Now, using taxpayer money for sports stadiums is nothing new, and there's no word on why this one failed. But some have pointed out, I mean, this isn't like Amazon or Ford or GM coming into town and providing thousands of jobs. I mean, the Royals aren't going to fire their executives and scouts if they move to a different place and hire a bunch of locals. Plus, the stadium jobs themselves, I mean, they're part-time, only a few months out of the year for a few hours a day. So the financial benefits are really hard to see.
Well, Dave, as always, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Tiff.
And that's all for today's news. For around-the-clock coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Good night.